I've got basically 8 minutes to tell you a bit about the research that colleagues and I have been doing, probably for about the last 15 years, actually, around how businesses and politicians have contributed and responded to the climate crisis. So most of my research focuses on climate change and the political and economic sort of issues around that. And I've just titled this presentation, Organising Responses to Climate Change, Mitigation, Adaptation and Suffering as Political Projects. That's actually the title of our recently published book, and I've just tweaked the title a bit to include the term projects given today's symposium, because in a sense what we're really arguing in our book and in our recent research has been around this issue of why it is that despite the scientific consensus on the urgency of the climate crisis and how bad things are getting, there is so little tangible response to that. And so our argument is that the responses, or the lack of tangible, effective response to climate change, is actually an organised political process, or possibly a project in that sense. So if we go to the next slide, so this was our previous book in 2015, which basically tried to unpick this issue that the American investigative journalist Elizabeth Kolbert phrased in an earlier book, where she raises this issue about why this conundrum, why it seems impossible to imagine that a technologically advanced society could choose, in essence, to destroy itself. But that's what we're now in the process of doing. And in our earlier book and in our just recently published book, that has been the sort of the key issue for us as people, social scientists interested in this issue. Why is it that we know technologically what is needed to decarbonise a global economy, and yet action is so limited, so minimal, and we're careering towards, as the UN was saying last week, probably around 2.5 degrees C above pre-industrial warming on a business as usual trajectory, if not worse than that. So next slide. The problem, of course, is not particularly profound. It's not rocket science. We've basically got a global economic system that's predicated upon annual compound growth ad infinitum, GDP growth continuing forever and ever and ever. And the dominant way in which we get that growth is through increased energy consumption. And depending on which countries you're looking at, but globally, the vast bulk of that energy comes from fossil energy, comes from coal, oil and gas. Next slide, thanks. So the issue here is really around why that is, and that slide doesn't really show what I wanted it to show, but that's all right, I'll just talk to it. In this is our recent book, we're basically arguing that there are growing international commitments for decarbonisation, as we've seen the various COPs and the various UN commitments to Paris Climate Agreement in 2015, for instance, to try and avoid greater than 2 degrees warming, or possibly even 1.5 C. So commitments, pledges, there's growing political and social activism over climate change that is becoming evident in movements like the school climate strikes and Extinction Rebellion and fossil fuel divestment. So there's growing social critique of the current political project, and yet what we term fossil fuel hegemony, the dominance of coal, oil and gas continues. So our question is, how does that happen? How is that actually achieved politically and economically? And so in our recent book, that's the cover of it, we basically look at and unpick how the corporate politics of carbon mitigation or emissions mitigation, climate adaptation and climate suffering are actually created and maintained over time. Next slide, please. So if we look at, for instance, the mitigation piece, we phrase this essentially as the politics of predatory delay, or possibly even the project of predatory delay, which is really about major energy producers, the big oil companies, BP, Shell, Gazprom, Saudi Aramco, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. BP, of course, in 2020 was one of the first to come out with a commitment to net zero emissions, which is a heroic assumption for an oil company. And of course, national governments since then have all jumped onto the net zero by 2050 sort of commitment. So there's a bandwagon effective business around commitments to decarbonisation, but also a commitment to continue growth and expansion of fossil energy. So there is this sort of conundrum. So how are the net zero commitments actually made discursively, and then how are they actually projected in terms of practice? And so there are proposals for technological fixes like carbon capture and storage, and discourses of clean gas, the hydrogen economy. And in doing that, of course, there's a distinction between what they see as sensible transition, which is minimal incremental change, versus others who propose more extreme type solutions. Next slide, please. In terms of adaptation, we're really focusing on how big corporations globally are trying to limit their operational and physical risk to climate impacts, but also on the flip side of that, the opportunities, the new markets, the new products, whether that's around sort of discourses of climate resilience, the advisory services that go around with that, disaster management, as well as the sort of the new market opportunities of a melting Arctic, changes in fisheries, changes in geology, which might assist greater fossil fuel extraction as well. Next slide. The third element in the book is basically looking at climate suffering and how that is structured politically in ways that don't really change things, I guess. And particularly we're looking at the way in which extreme weather events in developing economies are often constructed as climate spectacles. And this reinforces a sort of a politics of pity and caring at a distance, where we can offer thoughts and prayers to those who are suffering the impacts of climate change, rising sea levels, the South Pacific Islands, the flooding in Pakistan, for instance. And yet at the same time, there's almost a sort of a raising of the drawbridge as the developed economies increase their borders and try to sort of deal with the growing climate catastrophe. Next slide. So alternatives, we also sort of look at, well, what's the alternative to what's currently happening? And I haven't got time to go through these in detail, but we focus on three key issues here: decarbonisation, so the move towards renewable energy at scale and how that might be achieved with solar, wind and battery storage. We also look at proposals for degrowth, which is not really about blanket degrowth of entire economies, but degrowing the sectors that are impacting and harming climate ambitions and growing the sectors that are. And then finally, democratisation, which can take the forms of improved democratisation of energy and food and transport, and moving away from the centralised sort of corporate models that dominate our political economy. So final slide, thanks. So I'll finish with this. Obviously, 8 minutes, I haven't really got time to go through the details of what we look at, but by all means, have a look at the book. There's a lot in it. And I'll finish with this slide. You might have seen this cartoon by Tom Toro in the New Yorker magazine some years ago. It, in a sense, humorously, I think, gets to the bizarre, surreal reality we now face, where we're looking at the destruction of the life support systems of the planet. And yet that is justified around commitments to improved shareholder value. So I'll finish there, and thanks very much for your time.